My father, Henry Roberts, built Roberts Technologies from the ground up, working 80-hour days to create a tech empire worth hundreds of millions. For 22 years, he promised that my college fund would grow into something special enough to secure my future and eventually inherit the family business. But when I turned 18, ready to start at MIT, he sat me down with his new wife, Scarlett Turner, and her son, Jacob. "Elijah," he said, not meeting my eyes, "Jacob needs this opportunity more than you do. Struggled academically, and this money will give him the fresh start he deserves." My entire college fund, $200,000, was handed over to my stepbrother, who had barely graduated high school. "You're smart," Dad told me. "You'll figure something else out." What he didn't expect was that I would figure it out. By systematically acquiring enough shares to become the majority owner of Roberts Technologies, in my first executive decision, firing both Henry Roberts and Jacob Turner from the company that bore my family name. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in Millbrook Heights, I thought I had won the lottery of fathers. Henry Roberts wasn't just successful, he was legendary, starting with nothing but a computer science degree and an unshakable belief in the future of technology. He built Roberts Technologies from a garage startup into a powerhouse that dominated the Pacific Northwest tech scene. By the time I was 10, our company employed over 3,000 people across 4 states, with headquarters in the gleaming Cascade Tower that pierced the Seattle skyline like a steel and glass monument to Dad's vision. But success never changed the man I knew as my father. Every morning before heading to the office, Henry would sit with me at our kitchen table in our Millbrook Heights mansion, sharing coffee, hot chocolate for me, and talking about the future. "Elijah," he'd say, his eyes bright with possibility, "you're going to do things I never even dreamed of. This company, everything I've built, it's all going to be yours someday. But first, you need the education I never had." My college fund wasn't just money sitting in an account. It was a promise, wrapped in love and ambition. Every birthday, every Christmas, every academic achievement was celebrated with another deposit into what Dad called Elijah's future. He'd show me the statements, watching my eyes widen as the numbers grew. 20,000 became 50. 50 became 100. By my senior year of high school, that account held over $200,000, enough for any university in the country, plus graduate school if I wanted it. "MIT," I told him during one of our morning talks, sliding my acceptance letter across the table. "Full computer science program, just like you always said." Dad's face lit up like I'd just handed him the key to the universe. "MIT," he repeated, voice thick with pride. "Son, you're going to learn things there that will revolutionize this industry. When you come back, we'll build something together that makes Roberts Technologies look like a corner store." Mom had died when I was 14, cancer. Quick and brutal, but even in our grief, Dad and I had remained a team. He threw himself into work during the day and into being my father at night. Every school play, every baseball game, every science fair project, he was there. When other kids complained about absent parents, I felt guilty for having one who cared so much. Everything changed the summer before my senior year when Dad started dating Scarlett Turner. I should have seen the warning signs. Scarlett was beautiful, certainly elegant in that polished way that came from money and careful maintenance, but there was something calculating in her smile. Something that made me feel like she was always measuring, always evaluating what could benefit her. She worked in marketing for a smaller tech firm, which gave her and Dad common ground. But I noticed how quickly their conversations turned to Roberts Technologies' upcoming IPO, our quarterly earnings, our expansion plans. "Your father is remarkable," she'd tell me during family dinners that somehow became auditions for her maternal instincts. Building all this from nothing, he must be so excited to follow in his footsteps. But it was her son Jacob who really set my teeth on edge. 2 years older than me, Jacob Turner was everything I wasn't charming in a shallow way. Athletic without being particularly skilled, and possessed of that particular confidence that comes from never having been told no. He'd failed his SATs twice, barely graduated from Westfield Prep despite their reputation for social promotion, and seemed to view academic achievement as something that happened to other people. "School's just not my thing," he'd say with a shrug when Dad asked about his plans. "I'm more of a people person. I'll figure something out." What bothered me wasn't Jacob's lack of ambition. Plenty of people found success without traditional academics. What bothered me was how Dad started looking at him with something that looked dangerously like paternal approval. How conversations about family values and second chances crept into our morning talks. How Jacob's presence at our dinner table began feeling less like an occasional guest and more like a permanent fixture. When Dad and Scarlett announced their engagement 6 months later, I congratulated them with genuine happiness. Dad deserved love after years of loneliness, and if Scarlett made him smile again, I could learn to appreciate her calculating efficiency. What I didn't expect was how quickly Jacob would stop being Scarlett's son and start being positioned as Henry's stepson. "We're a family now," Dad announced at the engagement party, his arm around both Scarlett and Jacob. "All of us together." The first crack in my foundation came during spring break of my senior year. I was home from school, excitedly finalizing my MIT enrollment, when Dad asked me to meet him in his study. The same room where he'd shown me those college fund statements, where we'd planned my future over countless conversations. But this time, Scarlett and Jacob were already waiting when I arrived. "Sit down, son," Dad said, and something in his tone made my stomach clench. "We need to talk about your college plans." I sat, looking between the three faces that would determine my fate. Dad looked uncomfortable, avoiding my eyes. Wore an expression of sympathetic concern that didn't quite reach her eyes. Jacob just looked ... expectant. "Elijah," Dad began, his voice careful and measured, "you know how proud I am of you? How proud I've always been? You're brilliant, ambitious, everything I could have hoped for in a son." The word "but" hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall, but I prompted. "But Jacob is struggling right now. His grades, his confidence, his sense of direction. He needs help. Real help." Dad finally met my eyes. "And sometimes, as a family, we have to make sacrifices for each other." The room seemed to tilt sideways. "What kind of sacrifices?" Scarlett leaned forward, her voice dripping with manufactured warmth. "Elijah, sweetheart, you're so talented. You'll succeed anywhere you go. But Jacob... What? He needs this chance more than you do. He needs to know that his new family believes in him. Your college fund," Dad said quietly. "We're giving it to Jacob for a fresh start. Maybe community college first, then transfer somewhere. Build his confidence up." The words hit me like physical blows. "My college fund. The one you've been building since I was born. The one for MIT. You're smart enough to get scholarships," Dad said, and I could hear him trying to convince himself as much as me. "Work-study programs. Student loans. You'll find a way. But Jacob won't. Jacob needs to know he's part of this family," Scarlett interjected, "that we're investing in his future too." Looked at Jacob, waiting for him to say something, anything. To protest that he didn't want money that wasn't meant for him. To acknowledge what this meant to me. Instead, he shrugged. "I mean, if you're sure. College is expensive, and I've never really been good at the whole academic thing. Maybe with a fresh start." $200,000. 22 years of promises, a lifetime of planning gone. "Elijah," Dad said, reaching across the desk. "You'll understand someday. When you have a family of your own, you'll understand that sometimes love means sacrifice." I stood up slowly, my legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. "You're right, Dad. Someday I'll understand exactly what kind of love this is." As I walked out of that study, something fundamental broke inside me. Not just my trust in my father, but my understanding of the world itself. The man who had taught me about integrity, about keeping promises, about the value of hard work that man had just stolen my future to buy his new wife's love. But in that moment of devastation, something else was born. A cold, calculating part of me that began to understand exactly what Dad had taught me about business, about competition, about the ruthless efficiency required to build an empire. He'd given me a lesson that wasn't in any MIT curriculum. He'd shown me that, in the end, Even family was just another transaction, and I was about to become a very good student. The first 3 months after the betrayal were the darkest of my life. I moved out of the Millbrook Heights mansion the day after graduation, taking only what I could fit in my car and driving to a studio apartment in Belltown that I could barely afford with my part-time job at a computer repair shop. Dad called repeatedly during those first weeks, but I let every call go to voicemail. His messages started apologetic and grew increasingly frustrated. Elijah, pick up the phone. We need to talk about this like adults. Son, you can't just disappear because you didn't get your way. I'm trying to teach you about responsibility, about putting family first. Family first. The irony burned like acid in my throat. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. While Jacob was presumably preparing for his fresh start at community college with my money, I was learning what survival looked like. Ramen noodles for dinner, walking everywhere to save on gas, watching every penny disappear into rent and basic necessities, while my former classmates posted pictures from their orientation weeks at prestigious universities like MIT, had been understanding. When I explained my sudden financial situation, but understanding didn't change mathematics. Without the college fund, I was looking at over $200,000 in student loans for a degree that might take me 6 years to complete while working full-time. The financial aid office suggested starting at a community college myself, building up credits and saving money. The suggestion felt like a slap in the face, but something interesting happened. During those dark months of isolation and poverty, the helpless anger that had consumed me in Dad's study began crystallizing into something much more dangerous: purpose. I started spending my free time in the Seattle Public Library, not just browsing the internet, but systematically educating myself about corporate structure, business acquisition, and securities law. If I couldn't afford MIT, I could at least give myself a different kind of education. I read everything I could find about hostile takeovers, about how companies could be purchased by determined investors, about the legal pathways to corporate control. Late at night in my tiny apartment, I'd pull up Roberts Technologies' public filings and study them like sacred texts: revenue streams, profit margins, board composition, stock ownership percentages. Dad had taken the company public 3 years earlier, which meant shares were available for purchase by anyone with enough capital and patience. The idea that would consume the next 4 years of my life started as a bitter joke. What if I could somehow buy enough shares to become a voting member of the board? What if I could walk into a shareholders meeting and force Dad to look me in the eye? The fantasy was absurd. Roberts Technologies was worth hundreds of millions, and I was eating 99-cent mac and cheese for dinner. But the more I studied, the more the impossible began to look merely improbable. Dad owned 38% of the company's shares, a controlling interest, but not an absolute majority. The rest were scattered among institutional investors, pension funds, and thousands of individual shareholders. In theory, if someone could acquire enough of that dispersed stock, they could challenge Dad's control. The key word was someone. Someone with capital, connections, and the patience to execute a plan that would take years to unfold. I wasn't that someone yet, but I could become him. My transformation began with a decision that seemed modest at the time, but would define everything that followed. Instead of going to college immediately, I would spend 2 years building capital and learning the business world from the ground up, not as Henry Roberts' son, but as Elijah Roberts, anonymous worker with a grudge and a plan. I quit the computer repair shop and talked my way into an entry-level position at Meridian Capital, a mid-sized investment firm. In downtown Seattle, the pay was terrible. The hours were brutal. My colleagues treated me like furniture, but I was learning things no university could teach: how to analyze financial statements, how to identify undervalued assets, how to talk to people who controlled millions of dollars like their decisions were simple arithmetic. More importantly, I was building a network. Meridian's clients included several pension funds that held significant positions in Roberts Technologies stock. During my lunch breaks, I'd study their holdings, memorizing names and contact information. I volunteered for weekend events, industry conferences, anything that put me in rooms with people who made investment decisions for other people's money. "You're ambitious," observed Grace Parker, one of Meridian's senior partners, after I'd spent a Saturday organizing files for a client presentation. "What's your end game here?" "I want to understand how the game is really played," I told her, which was true enough. Grace became my first real mentor in the investment world. 20 years older than me, she'd built her career by being smarter and more ruthless than the men who'd tried to keep her out of their club. Under her guidance, I learned not just the technical aspects of finance, but the psychological elements that drove major decisions. "Money follows confidence," she told me during one of our weekly check-ins. "But confidence follows preparation. It's no more than everyone else in the room, and they'll assume you belong there." I followed her advice obsessively. I studied Roberts technologies with the intensity of a doctoral candidate, but I also branched out, learning about the entire tech sector, about market trends, about the regulatory environment that shaped corporate behavior. I read the Wall Street Journal every morning, tracked earnings reports, memorized the names and investment philosophies of major fund managers. After 18 months at Meridian, I'd saved enough money to open my own investment account and begin purchasing individual stocks. Not Roberts Technologies, not yet. It would come later when I had built enough credibility and capital to make meaningful moves. Instead, I focused on smaller tech companies using the research skills I'd developed. To identify undervalued opportunities, my first major success came with a software company called Bridge Solutions. I'd noticed that their quarterly reports showed strong fundamentals, but their stock price had been hammered by temporary supply chain issues. I invested $3,000, nearly everything I'd save. Dan watched the position triple over. 6 months, when the supply chain problems resolved and institutional investors rediscovered the company, $9,000 became $15,000. When I parlayed that success into another undervalued position, 15 became 25 became 40. By my second year at Meridian, I was managing a personal portfolio worth over $100,000, and my colleagues had begun asking for my opinion on tech sector investments. Grace promoted me to junior analyst, which came with a significant salary increase and, more importantly, access to institutional clients who controlled the kind of money that could move markets. But even as my professional life flourished, emotional wound remained raw. Dad's calls had stopped after the first year, replaced by stilted holiday cards signed by both him and Scarlett. No personal messages. No requests to reconcile. Just his signature on pre-printed sentiments about family and togetherness. I heard about Jacob through mutual acquaintances. He'd lasted 1 semester at community college before dropping out, claiming the coursework wasn't practical enough. Last anyone knew, he was working at a recreational equipment store and talking about maybe starting a YouTube channel about outdoor adventures. $200,000 for a part-time retail job and social media fantasies. The information should have made me angry, but instead it clarified something important. This was never really about Jacob. He was just a convenient excuse for Dad to demonstrate where his priorities lay. When choosing between his biological son and his new wife's happiness, that realization transformed my planning. From emotional revenge into something colder and more systematic. I wasn't trying to hurt Henry Roberts because he'd disappointed me. I was going to take control of Roberts Technologies because I could, and because doing so would demonstrate a fundamental truth he'd taught me himself. In business, family loyalty was just another weakness to exploit. During my 3rd year at Meridian, I began reaching out to the institutional investors who held Roberts Technologies shares. Not to buy their positions, I wasn't ready for that yet, but to build relationships, to understand their investment criteria, to position myself as someone worth knowing in the tech investment community. You're very focused on Roberts Technologies. For someone who doesn't work there, observed Michael Phillips, a fund manager who controlled nearly 2 million shares. I think there might be some interesting opportunities developing, I told him. The current leadership is getting complacent. Sometimes companies need fresh perspectives. It was the first time I'd voiced my intentions out loud, even obliquely. Michael's response would help me gauge whether the financial community might be receptive to change at Roberts Technologies. Henry Roberts built something impressive, Michael said carefully. But you're right that the company's growth has plateaued. If the right person came along with the right vision, he shrugged. Stranger things have happened. That conversation marked the beginning of the final phase of my preparation. I wasn't just building capital and relationships anymore. I was building a coalition. By my 4th year away from home, I had evolved into someone my teenage self wouldn't have recognized. Gone was the eager college-bound kid who believed in promises and family loyalty. In his place was a 22-year-old investment analyst who owned a diversified portfolio worth $300,000, maintained relationships with fund managers controlling billions in assets, and could analyze a company's financial structure with surgical precision. More importantly, I had become invisible to the people who mattered most. Henry Roberts was so consumed with his new family and his increasingly comfortable position as CEO of a stable, profitable company that he'd stopped paying attention to the broader investment community surrounding Roberts Technologies. If he'd been watching, he might have noticed that several major shareholders had been asking unusual questions about succession planning, long-term growth strategies, and the company's responsiveness to shareholder concerns. He definitely would have noticed that his estranged son had become a name whispered in certain investment circles as someone worth watching. My breakthrough came through an unexpected source, Amelia Wright, journalist at Pacific Business Weekly who'd been following my success with small-cap tech investments. She reached out for a profile piece about young analysts making waves in the Seattle market. And during our interview, I made a calculated decision to reveal part of my story. "Your last name is Roberts," she observed, scanning her notes. "Any relation to Henry Roberts at Roberts Technologies?" "He's my father," I said simply. "We're not particularly close these days." Amelia's eyebrows rose. "That must create some interesting dynamics given your position in the investment community." "It creates opportunities for objectivity," I replied. "I can analyze Roberts Technologies without emotional attachment to current management." The article that resulted was carefully worded but devastating in its implications. Amelia had positioned me as a rising star in tech investment analysis, while subtly highlighting the irony of Henry Roberts' son becoming successful despite rather than because you have family connections. She quoted my assessment of Roberts Technologies as a company with strong fundamentals that could benefit from more aggressive growth strategies and younger leadership perspectives. The piece ran on a Thursday morning. By Friday afternoon, I'd received calls from 6 different fund managers who wanted to discuss my thoughts on Roberts Technologies in more detail. "You really think the company is underperforming?" asked Violet Price, who managed a pension fund with significant Roberts holdings. "I think it's being managed conservatively by someone who's lost his hunger," I told her. "Henry Roberts was brilliant 20 years ago, but he settled into maintaining what he built rather than pushing for what could come next." These conversations were delicate dances around the real question everyone wanted to ask. Was I planning some kind of move against my own father's company? I never stated my intentions directly, but I began floating hypothetical scenarios about how a committed investor with deep industry knowledge might be able to influence Roberts Technologies' direction. "The company's debt-to-equity ratio is excellent," I'd point out. "Cash flow is strong, the core business lines are solid, but look at their R&D spending compared to competitors. Look at their market share growth over the past 3 years. Someone with a clear vision for aggressive expansion could make shareholders very happy." What I was really doing was building a case for change while identifying potential allies for when I was ready to make my move, the intelligence gathering phase of my plan required reconnecting with people I'd known before the betrayal, but from my new position of strength. I started attending industry events where Roberts Technologies employees were likely to be present, not to confront anyone, but to listen and learn. At a tech innovation conference in Portland, I ran into Harper Russo, who'd been Dad's director of operations for over a decade. She'd known me since I was 12 years old, and her shock at seeing me was followed quickly by genuine warmth. "Elijah, my God, look at you. I heard you were doing well for yourself, but..." She gestured at my tailored suit and confident bearing. "You look like you belong in the C-suite already." "I'm learning," I said with a smile. "How are things at Roberts Technologies?" Dad keeping everyone busy? Harper's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Your father is? Well, he's focused on family these days. Scarlett has some strong opinions about company direction. This was exactly the kind of information I'd hoped to gather. She's taking an active role in the business. Active might be an understatement. She's been pushing for some interesting, strategic decisions. Wants to expand into consumer products, diversify beyond enterprise software. Not everyone thinks it's the right move. I filed that information away carefully. Internal disagreement about strategic direction was exactly the kind of vulnerability that could be exploited by someone with a clear alternative vision. And Jacob? I asked, keeping my tone casually curious. I heard he was figuring out his career path. Harper's laugh was bitter. Jacob Turner is now a special advisor to the CEO. With an office on the executive floor and a salary that would make our senior engineers jealous, his primary qualification seems to be access to Scarlett's ear during family dinners. The picture that emerged from this and similar conversations was deeply troubling from a corporate governance perspective, and deeply encouraging from my strategic standpoint. Dad had allowed his personal life to contaminate his business judgment in ways that were creating resentment among longtime employees and uncertainty about the company's future direction. Even more interesting were the financial details. I'd managed to piece together about Dad's stock holdings. Through public filings and careful observation of trading patterns, I'd determined that he'd actually been slowly reducing his position in the company over the past 2 years. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger disclosure requirements, but significant. Enough to suggest that his 38% controlling interest might be closer to 32 or 33% by now. If that was accurate, it meant my timeline for acquisition could be accelerated significantly. The confirmation came through Kimberly Wallace, securities lawyer I'd met through Meridian, who specialized in corporate governance issues. During a casual conversation about theoretical takeover scenarios, I'd asked her about the mechanics of challenging a founder's control of a public company. Depends on the ownership structure, she'd explained. If you could assemble 35% of the outstanding shares, you could force significant board changes. 40% would give you practical control over major decisions. Anything above 45%, and you're effectively running the company? What about if the founder only holds 32 or 33%? Kimberly had looked at me with sharp interest. Then you'd only need to match that position to create a deadlock, or exceed it by a few percentage points to take control. Why do you ask? Just thinking through some scenarios, I'd said, but I was thinking through much more than scenarios. I was thinking through the endgame. My personal portfolio had grown to nearly half, $1 million through careful reinvestment, in several successful positions in emerging tech companies. More importantly, the relationships I'd built over 4 years of networking had evolved into something approaching trust among several major institutional investors. When Violet Price mentioned during our quarterly check-in that her pension fund was considering reducing its exposure to Roberts Technologies due to concerns about strategic direction and management succession planning, I knew the time for passive observation was ending. What would change your assessment? I asked her. New leadership with a clear vision for growth, someone who understands both the technology and the market dynamics, someone with skin in the game who could make the hard decisions Henry Roberts seems unwilling to make. Someone like who? Violet had smiled. You tell me, Elijah. You're the one who's been studying this company like it's your dissertation topic. That night I began drafting the business plan that would justify everything I was about to do. Just a hostile takeover, but a complete strategic transformation of Roberts. Technologies that would demonstrate exactly what Henry Roberts had thrown away when he chose Scarlett. Turner's approval over his son's future. The plan was brilliant, if I did say so myself, and in 6 months, I would have the capital and coalition necessary to implement it. Dad had taught me that family was just another business transaction. I was about to show him how those transactions worked when you weren't the one with all the leverage. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in October. Exactly 4 years and 3 months after I'd walked out of Dad's study. I was reviewing quarterly earnings reports in my downtown Seattle office. I'd left Meridian the previous year to start my own investment advisory firm when Luna Ferrari An old contact at Goldman Sachs called with news that made my pulse. "Quicken, Elijah. You need to hear this. Blackstone Capital is looking to divest their entire position in Roberts Technologies. 0.7 million shares. They want to move quickly and quietly. I set down my coffee carefully, processing the implications. Blackstone's position represented nearly 12% of Roberts Technologies' outstanding shares. Combined with my existing holdings and the commitments I'd secured from other institutional investors, their block would give me enough voting power to challenge Dad's control directly. "What's driving the sale?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "Performance concerns. Roberts Technologies' stock has been flat for 18 months, while the broader tech sector gained 30%. Their board presentation last month was apparently uninspiring. Blackstone wants to redeploy that capital into companies with better growth trajectories. This was the opportunity I'd been building toward for 4 years. Everything, the relationships, the capital, the detailed knowledge of Roberts Technologies' operations and vulnerabilities, had prepared me for this moment. "What's their timeline?" I asked. "They want to close within 60 days. Price is negotiable. For the right buyer, but they're looking for someone who can take the full position." The full position. 8.7 million shares at current market prices would cost approximately $130 million. It was far beyond my personal resources, but I'd spent months laying the groundwork for exactly this scenario. "Luna, I'm interested. Very interested. Can you arrange a preliminary discussion?" After she hung up, I sat in my office overlooking Elliott Bay and allowed myself a moment of quiet satisfaction. For 4 years, I'd been patient, methodical, building the pieces of a plan that had seemed impossible when I was sleeping on a mattress in a Belltown studio apartment. Now the final piece was falling into place. But first, I needed to ensure my coalition was solid. The next 3 weeks were a blur of careful negotiations and strategic presentations. I'd been cultivating relationships with institutional investors for years, but now I needed to convert those relationships into concrete commitments. Not just to purchase Roberts Technologies shares, but to vote those shares according to my strategic vision for the company's future. My presentation to potential investors was masterful, if I did say so myself. I'd spent months crafting a comprehensive analysis of Roberts Technologies' current position and future potential that was devastating in its precision. Declining market share in core business segments, missed opportunities in emerging technologies, management decisions that prioritized stability over growth. Most damning was my comparison of Roberts Technologies' performance to similar companies that had undergone management changes in recent years. The data clearly showed that technology companies with aging founder CEOs consistently underperformed until fresh leadership brought new energy and strategic focus. Henry Roberts was visionary 20 years ago, I told a roomful of fund managers at a private dinner in Bellevue, but visionaries don't always make the best stewards of established companies. Roberts Technologies needs leadership that's focused on the next 20 years, not the last 20. Michael Phillips, who controlled the fund with the largest Roberts Technologies position after Blackstone, raised his hand. "You're talking about a complete management overhaul. That's not just replacing a CEO. You're talking about dismantling everything Henry Roberts built. I'm talking about fulfilling the potential he created," I corrected. "Roberts Technologies has incredible assets, cutting-edge technology, talented employees, strong market position, excellent financial fundamentals. But those assets are being underutilized by management that's lost its innovative edge. And you believe you could do better?" asked Violet Price. This was the moment I'd been preparing for. It's the moment where I had to convince seasoned investors that a 26-year-old with no executive experience could successfully lead a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. "I believe I can surround myself with the right people and make the decisions Henry Roberts is unwilling to make," I said. "Cut underperforming divisions. Invest aggressively in R&D. Pursue strategic acquisitions that expand our market reach. Roberts Technologies could be a $10 billion company within 5 years with the right leadership and strategic focus." The questions that followed were technical, detailed, and occasionally hostile. But I'd spent 4 years preparing for exactly these challenges. I had answers for everything: specific revenue projections, detailed operational plans, comprehensive analyses of competitive threats and market opportunities. By the end of the evening, I had preliminary commitments from fund managers controlling over 20% of Roberts Technologies' outstanding shares, combined with Blackstone's block and my personal holdings. That would give me operational control of the company. The actual acquisition of Blackstone's position required 3 weeks of complex negotiations involving bank financing, legal documentation, and careful timing to avoid triggering premature disclosure requirements. I structured the deal through a newly created investment entity called Cascade Holdings, a name chosen specifically to remind everyone that Roberts Technologies' headquarters sat in the shadow of the Cascade Mountains where Dad had taught me. To appreciate the view from the top, the financing was the most challenging aspect. Even with commitments from institutional partners, I needed to secure personal debt of over $40 million to complete my portion of the purchase. But my 4-year track record of successful investments and the detailed business plan for Roberts Technologies' transformation convinced 2 private banks to provide the necessary capital. On November 15th, exactly 1 week before Thanksgiving, the transaction closed. In a single day, I went from owning scattered shares in my father's company to controlling a coalition that represented 46% of Roberts Technologies' voting stock. According to securities law, I now had 10 days to file disclosure documents with the SEC announcing my position and intentions regarding Roberts Technologies. Those documents would be public, which meant Dad would finally learn that his estranged son had become his company's largest shareholder. But first, I wanted to have a conversation with the executive team. I scheduled a meeting with Roberts Technologies board of directors for the Tuesday after Thanksgiving, requesting time to discuss strategic opportunities and concerns regarding the company's current direction. As the largest shareholder, they couldn't refuse the meeting, though I was sure they were curious about who exactly Cascade Holdings represented. They would find out soon enough. On Thanksgiving Day, while Dad was presumably carving turkey with Scarlett and Jacob in the Millbrook Heights mansion, I sat in my downtown apartment and read through Roberts Technologies' latest quarterly report one final time. Not as an outside analyst studying investment opportunities, but as the person who would soon be making the decisions about the company's future. The irony wasn't lost on me. Dad had given away my college fund to teach me about family sacrifice and putting others first. In response, I'd given myself an education in corporate acquisition and strategic planning that no university could have provided. He'd wanted to teach me about family values. Instead, he'd taught me that family was just another market force to be understood and leveraged. In 5 days, I would walk into Roberts Technologies' boardroom and demonstrate exactly how well I'd learned that lesson. Dad had always said that success in business required vision, preparation, and the willingness to make hard decisions. For the first time in 4 years, we were going to find out if he'd been right. The Roberts Technologies boardroom had always intimidated me as a teenager. Now, walking in as the company's largest shareholder, it felt like a stage designed specifically for this moment. The 12-person board sat around the polished oak table, with Dad at the head, looking confident but curious about the mysterious Cascade Holdings representative who'd requested this meeting. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, setting my briefcase on the table. "Thank you for accommodating this discussion on short notice. I'm here representing Cascade Holdings, which as of last week holds 46% of Roberts Technologies' outstanding shares." Murmurs rippled around the table. That percentage meant operational control enough to dictate board composition, strategic direction, and executive leadership. "Before we discuss the future," I continued, removing my suit jacket and loosening my tie, "I'd like to address some concerns about current management." Dad leaned forward. "I'm sure we can address any concerns you might have, Mr." I turned to face him directly. "Roberts, Elijah Roberts." The blood drained from his face. Around the table, board members who'd known me since childhood sat in stunned silence. Harper Rousseau, still director of operations, actually gasped, "Hello, Dad." His mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Behind him, Jacob, who'd apparently been invited as special advisor to the CEO, looked like he was about to be sick. 4 years ago," I said, my voice steady and professional, Roberts made a decision that taught me everything I needed to know about business leadership. He broke a 22-year promise to fund his son's education, choosing instead to invest that money in someone with no qualifications, no commitment, and no accountability. I clicked open my briefcase and removed a thick folder. That decision cost Roberts Technologies its future CEO and cost me my faith and family loyalty. But it taught me something invaluable, that emotional leadership makes terrible business decisions. Elijah, Dad finally managed. We need to talk privately. We're talking now, I interrupted. In front of the board that needs to understand why change is necessary. I opened the folder, revealing detailed financial analysis and strategic projections. Roberts Technologies has underperformed the tech sector by 30% over the past 18 months. Market share is declining in core segments. R&D investment has flatlined. Meanwhile, the CEO's stepson, whose primary qualification is family connection, draws a six-figure salary for undefined responsibilities. Jacob started to speak, but I continued. The same leadership that thought Jacob Turner was worth a $200,000 investment now controls a company worth hundreds of millions. The board needs to decide if that judgment inspires confidence. Dad found his voice. Can't just walk in here, and actually I can. I distributed copies of the ownership documentation. 46% says I can. My first recommendation as the largest shareholder is immediate leadership change. The room was dead silent. I'm calling for Henry Roberts' resignation as CEO, effective immediately. I'm also recommending the termination of Jacob Turner's advisory position, since his employment appears to violate several nepotism policies. Dad stared at me across the table, 22 years of fatherhood colliding with the reality of what he'd created. Motion to vote, said Violet Price, who was also on Roberts Technologies' board. Seconded came from 3 other directors simultaneously. Within 30 minutes, both Dad and Jacob were escorted from the building. I'd kept my promise from that day in his study 4 years ago. I'd figured something else out. 6 months after the boardroom confrontation that changed everything, stood in the corner office that had once belonged to my father, watching the Seattle skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. The nameplate on my desk read Elijah Roberts, Chief Executive Officer. But the title felt less important than what it represented. The completion of a journey that had transformed both me and the company that bore our family name, Roberts Technologies. Under my leadership had become unrecognizable from the stagnant corporation Dad had been content to maintain. We'd cut underperforming divisions, doubled our R&D budget, and acquired 3 smaller companies that complemented our core technology offerings. Our stock price had climbed 43% in 6 months, vindicating every investorhood. Trusted my vision over Dad's track record, but success in business felt hollow compared to the more complex emotional aftermath of what I'd accomplished, the immediate consequences of that. November board meeting had been swift and brutal. Dad had cleaned out his office in silence, taking only personal mementos and the family photos that had once decorated his desk. Jacob had lasted exactly 1 day after the vote, showing up to argue with HR about his severance package before security escorted him out permanently. Scarlett had filed for divorce within 2 months. Apparently, being married to an unemployed former CEO was less appealing than being married to a tech mogul. She'd walked away with a significant settlement, but had lost access to the social status and financial security that marrying Henry Roberts had provided. The house in Millbrook Heights, the mansion where I'd grown up, dreaming about my future, had been sold to cover Dad's personal debts and legal fees. He'd leveraged heavily against his Roberts Technologies stock over the years, never imagining that someone might challenge his control of the company. When that stock became worthless overnight, following his termination, the financial house of cards collapsed. Last I'd heard, he was living in a modest apartment in Tacoma, working as a consultant for small tech startups. Not destitute, but a far cry from the empire he'd once controlled. Jacob had moved back in with his mother in her Bellevue condo, where he'd started a podcast about entrepreneurial mindset and overcoming setbacks. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew the real story, but revenge, I'd discovered, was a dish that left you hungry even after you'd consumed it completely. The professional satisfaction of transforming Roberts Technologies couldn't fill the emotional void left by the complete destruction of my relationship with my father. We hadn't spoken since that board meeting, despite my attempts to reach out in the weeks that followed. Kier's pride, apparently, wouldn't allow him to reconcile with the son who'd systematically dismantled everything he'd built. "You're thinking too hard again," observed Ava Johnson, my newly hired chief operating officer, as she knocked on my open door. The quarterly reports don't analyze themselves through telepathy. Ava had been one of my first major hires, a brilliant operations executive who'd left Microsoft to help me reshape Roberts Technologies. Her practical wisdom had become invaluable during the chaotic months of corporate transformation. "Just reflecting on how we got here," I told her, gesturing toward the reports scattered across my desk. "Sometimes I wonder if there was a better way to handle all this." "You mean a way that didn't involve publicly humiliating your father and stepbrother?" she asked with characteristic directness. "Something like that." Ava settled into the chair. "Across from my desk, Elijah, you were 18 years old when they stole your college fund. You had every right to be angry, and you channeled that anger into something productive rather than destructive. Most people would have just stayed bitter. I'm not sure this counts as non-destructive." "Look around," she said, pointing toward the bustling office floor visible through my windows. "This company employs 4,200 people now, up from 3,000 when you took over. Our employees have stock options that are actually worth something. We're innovating again instead of just maintaining. You didn't destroy Roberts Technologies. You saved it." Her words carried truth. But they didn't erase the complicated grief I felt about Dad. The man who'd betrayed me had also taught me everything I knew about determination, strategic thinking, and the importance of building something meaningful. His failures as a father didn't negate his success as my first teacher about business and ambition. 3 weeks later, I received an unexpected visitor. Harper Rousseau knocked on my door, carrying a manila envelope and wearing an expression I couldn't quite read. "This came for you," she said, setting the envelope on my desk. "Personal delivery, no return address." Inside was a handwritten letter on stationery I recognized the expensive paper Dad had always used for important correspondence. "Elijah, I've spent 6 months trying to find the right words to respond to what happened in that boardroom. I keep starting letters that I never finish, because nothing I write captures how I feel about what I did to you and what you did to me in return. I was wrong to give away your college fund. I was wrong to choose Scarlett's approval over your future. I was wrong to believe that family meant you would forgive anything I did because you had no choice. But you were right about one thing. I'd lost my hunger for building something great. I had become comfortable with maintaining what I'd created instead of pushing for what could come next. Roberts Technologies needed someone who still believed in its potential. I'm proud of what you've accomplished, even though it came at my expense. You've become the leader I taught you to be, even if you had to become my enemy to do it. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect a relationship. I just wanted you to know that the son I raised didn't disappoint me. He exceeded every expectation I ever had. Your father." Henry, I read the letter 3 times before setting it aside and returning to the quarterly reports that needed my attention. But for the first time in 6 months, the weight in my chest felt lighter. Roberts Technologies continued to thrive under my leadership, eventually going on to become the $10 billion company I'd promised investors it could be. Dad never returned to the tech industry in any significant way. But occasionally, I'd hear about his work mentoring young entrepreneurs. It reminded me of the man he'd been before Scarlett Turner, convinced him that family loyalty meant saying yes to everything. Jacob remained Jacob always. Looking for the next opportunity that would require minimal effort for maximum reward. Some people never change, but I had changed, fundamentally and permanently. The betrayal that destroyed my faith in family had taught me to build something stronger, a life based on merit, accountability, and the understanding that love without respect was just another form of manipulation, and sometimes late at night. In the office Dad had once occupied, I'd look out at the city lights and feel something that might have been forgiveness. Not for what he'd done, but for what we'd both become in the aftermath. Success. It turned out was indeed the best revenge. But it was also the best foundation for whatever came next. Up next, You've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.